All right. According to my screen, we are live. And by we, I mean me, because it's the holiday season, and here I am all by my lonesome. My father-in-law, Abe, is off in another country taking photographs, and I'm here at a friend's house in Syracuse, New York. So everybody else is somewhere else right now, and I'm here live streaming with you, which is awesome. And I'm very excited to be here because next week we have First Amendment, or our next episode. I'm not sure if it's next week because I have to wait and find out if we can get our special guest for you. But the next time we're live for you, we will be doing the First Amendment. And that is, of course, a really famous one. And everybody has opinions about the First Amendment and what it means to them and what it means to the country as a whole. And there are lots of opinions about how the First Amendment has been interpreted by the Supreme Court over the years. And that's one of the reasons why I'm trying to get a special guest for you, because it's complicated. I think if anything has become clear to me just in the few episodes that we've done with my father-in-law, it's that not being a lawyer and not ever having had to study precedent before, there is a lot about the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that I thought I understood, but the process that the document has gone through has left me kind of surprised. And I think nowhere will we be more surprised, or at least interested, than when it comes to our First Amendment rights. So if we're waiting to do First Amendment until we've got our lawyer present, what am I here for today? This is what I am here for. There have been some important discussions philosophically around parts of the First Amendment over the years, over the 200 plus odd years that the United States has been a United States. Some of those conversations happened at the philosophical level, and some of them have happened at the legal level, and some of them have just happened between friends over beer. We're going to go to the philosophical level for a little bit, because there are some things that were said by a couple of guys who you may or may not know that this is where these things came from. If you ever saw the movie Brazil with Jonathan Pryce and Katherine Hellman, directed by Terry Gilliam, if you haven't seen it, you really must. You must, absolutely. But it is funny, it is sad, it is disturbing in a couple of places. It is more than anything else thought-provoking, and that's always a good thing in my book. Along with it being thought-provoking, there is a statement that gets repeated throughout, and it is the ghost in the machine. That comes from one of the documents that we are going to, or that comes from the writer of one of the documents that we are going to take a look at later today. So if you already know that, you know who we're going to talk about, and you probably know why. And well done, you. Let me show you who we're going to talk about, because this used to crack my kids up when I showed them this picture. This was who I used to say was the original hippie. This is the guy who decided to go to the woods to live deliberately, to suck the marrow out of life, as it were. This is Henry David Thoreau, and he was the guy who, after reading an essay by his friend at the time, fellow transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson. He read Emerson's essay called Self-Reliance, and he went to his buddy Emerson and said, "Yo, dude, I want to live on your property for free, more or less, and I want to just be." So 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. That's how long Thoreau lived on Walden Pond, which was part of Emerson's property. You can still go and see a cabin at Walden Pond. The Walden Pond is still there. It doesn't look like it used to, but it's still there, which is still pretty impressive in my book. The shack that he had lived in, and really it was a shack. The shack that he lived in didn't survive. However, not too long ago, they found the hearth stones for his dwelling place, and it matched all of his other descriptions of where he was. And so people have marked that out and said, great, here's where the dude actually spent his 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days. They have reconstructed a shack that you can go into to experience how it might have been to live in something like that, especially in the wintertime. Now, it sounds like that must have been very difficult for him to handle, but the truth of the matter is he was on Emerson's property, which means he didn't have very far to walk to go and hang out with the Emersons. Yes, he lived in the shack, in that he slept there, he woke up there, he wrote there, certainly. Did he spend every waking minute there? No. He was a social creature as well. And that really does start to come across the more that you read things that he had to say. So if your image of Thoreau is some guy who kind of put himself into voluntary solitary confinement, that's not it. In fact, he's such a social creature that he wrote the document that we're going to talk about very soon, in part as a social act. There were things going on in society at the time that he felt very strongly about, and felt very strongly that these things were, in fact, deeply, deeply wrong. The thing that was most important to him at the time was we were involved in a war. This is 1845. We're involved in a war in Mexico, and the money that was being slashed with when it came to this war, he felt was, to begin with, that money was being used, at least in part, to keep the institution of slavery, chattel slavery, as practiced in the United States, to keep it going here in the United States. And he had a fundamental problem with that. That was not something that he wanted to have happen with his tax dollars. So he was very, very comfortable with the concept of resisting civil government, our civilization, our civilization's government, in a civil, that would be well-mannered, transactional way. He felt that civil disobedience was an appropriate response. Part of the reason why he felt this way is because it's very hard to get your government to listen to you. And if he felt this way in 1845, when there were considerably fewer people in the place than there are now, his words can only mean more now. It's been a while. He had several lines out of this essay that he wrote. It's a long essay. It's like 46 paragraphs long, and it's called Civil Disobedience by people when they're just talking quickly, but it is really called On Resistance to Civil Government. It has colloquially become Civil Disobedience. It's just an essay that he wrote, and part of this is because he was jailed. He refused to pay the tax that was going to go fund the war that he thought was unjust because the war and the taxes were going to keep slavery going. He refused to pay the tax. They put him in jail for like a day, 2 days. It's nothing. It's like, think of the jail in Blazing Saddles. It was probably not even that much. He just kind of had a cot in a room where there was a guy who had handcuffs. It didn't matter. And he was more than willing to pay that price to the civilization for having disobeyed that civilization in a civil manner. It's an extension of the understanding of the social contract, which Locke, Hobbes, and Rousseau, these guys, we're going to wind up talking about them more as we get further and further into the Constitution, because they were these big Enlightenment thinkers. Everybody who was writing the Constitution, Bill of Rights, all of that, they all had read these philosophers. And you can even see in texts that Jefferson wrote, texts that Franklin wrote, and in fact, the text that I read to you a couple weeks ago, you can see the fingerprints of these philosophers and their philosophies on these documents, all of the early colonial documents. You can see the fingerprints all over them, but you can also see the fingerprints of the scientists at the time on those documents, or scientists maybe that preceded just a little bit, late Renaissance, early Enlightenment thinkers. So we have Thoreau with this understanding that there is a social contract, that the government will govern us appropriately and well, and that we, in return, will hold up our end of the bargain, which would be our responsibilities. We have rights, but we also have responsibilities. We are supposed to pay our taxes. We are supposed to vote. We are supposed to keep ourselves informed in such a way as allows us to make the decisions that are required to know about paying our taxes, about voting, about where our bodies are needed. Before there was a standing army, there were militias. This is the Second Amendment, the well-regulated militia. So it was important if you had people who could come in and invade very easily, either British colonies that were British garrisons that had their officers and their soldiers there, who could, depending on what time period we're talking about, head out, and you needed somebody to sound the alarm out. The British are coming, the British are coming. Everybody grabs their muskets, the guys who have agreed to be part of the militia, and they protect the polis, the people. That's how the militia worked. Now, by the time Alexander Hamilton came around, and this is a big deal because this is really, really well explained in the Ron Chernow book. It is alluded to in the musical, in some places a little bit more clearly than others, but one of the places where Hamilton and Washington, both in the post-war period, had real problems with the original Articles of Confederation, and then they wound up lobbying more heavily for remuneration for this particular problem in the Constitution. One of the things that was a particular sticking point to Hamilton and Washington as well, but Hamilton was louder about it, was paying the soldiers. These guys fought the war against the British. They won against the most major superpower on the planet at the time, and they weren't getting paid. And they weren't getting paid because the southern states said, well, you know, all of that fighting, or most of it, not really all of it, most of it happened up there in the north. It was your problem. You deal with it. You pay for it. Well, most of the soldiers were yours. You pay for it. Whereas the northern states said, hey, you're reaping the benefit of our blood spilled on the ground. The least you could do is pay up so that we can pay the widows and children and the men who are wounded and can no longer farm. We got people who need to get paid, dude. Hamilton originally refused to take his pension because he was so appalled that he was being offered payment, but none of his fellow soldiers, the men that he served with, or the men who were in fact working under him, were getting pensions. And that caused a problem later on. His wife had to go down to Washington, D.C. after he'd been killed and really shame everybody into paying her what he should have been getting, well, what she should have been getting through his service, because her service was massive and he didn't leave her with much. He was never a rich man to begin with. And again, in an act of social contract, Eliza Hamilton, she didn't just take the money and run. She took the money to survive on and then proceeded to get the Washington Monument made. She started the first private orphanage in New York City, which, you know, if you've listened to the musical. she was constantly at work to make our world a better place. Because again, to her, to Hamilton, to all of these guys who were Enlightenment thinkers who came out of the Enlightenment thinking, this idea of we're all in this together and we all benefit when we are offering our best selves to each other in a spirit of communal understanding. I may not agree with you, but I will listen to you. I will consider what you have to say, because you may say something new that I haven't heard before. Maybe you read a good book last night and it's influenced you. Maybe you read a new essay that just sparked your thinking, and great. But the understanding that there was going to be this exchange of ideas and solutions where people would be considering the facts presented and then weigh out and balance the benefits to the people, the country, the local citizenry. All of that was an understanding that was just kind of a given for these guys. The longer the country went on, the fewer of these guys we had. And eventually they died out, and we wound up with the children of some of these guys. We had John Quincy Adams at that point. And then they went south. And then we wound up with people like Andrew Jackson. The 1800s were a really interesting time politically. And I look back on my own education when I was in high school, and I am flabbergasted at how little of the good stuff I learned back then. We can talk about them later. But right now, 1845, the Mexican War and its influence on Thoreau is not small, because he still is working from that idea of a social contract, and also the idea that a government's job is to serve the people. And that may sound kind of simplistic to our modern and perhaps more jaded ears, but it's really not. And I'm going to give you some Thoreauvian wisdom as we go along by reading a couple of things to you, but I also wanted to share a couple more images for you as well. So these guys were, pretty deep. I'm going to give you a couple of Emerson quotes first. Envy is ignorance. Imitation is suicide, which I showed to my 16-year-old, and his first reaction was, what? That's not true. And then his second reaction was, wait. So if you envy someone, it means you're not paying attention to what you are doing or what you want. So you're ignoring the perhaps important parts of you. And imitation is suicide. That means if you're imitating someone else, you're letting the part of you that is unique die. So then he said, oh, I guess that does make sense. So that was one of the Emerson quotes, which I thought was pretty cool. And then the other one I thought I would share with you is this one, because I thought this was funny. This is the other thing about these transcendentalist guys, is they look so severe and so, kind of stolid, and, well, they look very black and white. In these old pictures, they don't look like they're very funny. And yet, I love this idea. Common sense is genius dressed up in its working clothes, indicating to me that common sense is not remotely common, because genius is not very common, but it comes across as being just a regular thing that everyone should have access to, because it's dressed in just normal clothes. And that I loved. Then there was another quote that I wanted to give you that I thought was funny. This is the end of Emerson. So Emerson came before Thoreau, and he was a famous lecturer and essayist before he met Thoreau. So he's older than Thoreau. But this idea of all my best thoughts were stolen by the ancients just cracks me up, because it's true, right? You have this great idea. You think, oh my gosh, this is so unique. This is so amazing. This is so 100% new and me, and it's fabulous. And then you find out somebody else came up with it before. And Emerson's not wrong. I would imagine that most of his stuff was A, really good, and B, it probably had been written about at least by Thoreau, by Aristotle, maybe, or one of those guys, because he's really smart. So that was Emerson. Now, Thoreau talked a lot about the majority and the minority. I think that he is the one who coined the term the tyranny of the majority. No, that's not right. Tyranny of the minority, but that's not the part we're talking about today. He said, I think we should be men first and subjects afterward. It is not desirable to cultivate a respect for the law so much as for the right. So don't worry about the law so much. Worry about doing what's right. Now, you might think, well, wait a minute, that's kind of dangerous because what you think is right may not be what I think is right, and that gets us into a whole bunch of trouble. And that's true now, and it was true back then too. A few people. But one of the reasons why he says this is because his expectation is that people will come to a decision about what is or is not right, capital R, morality, right, after long periods of introspection and study. You'll read, you'll think, you'll discuss, you'll debate, because more than anything, his mainstay is you will not ever take what somebody else has told you as gospel. You have to think about it. You have to figure it out. I know I made a comment years ago on CraftLit that the most thoughtful, moral people I think I've ever known have been atheists. Not because they were, oh, all atheists are fabulous or anything like that. It was that by deciding that you are going to not believe in God, that you are not going to put any kind of faith in any of that, that means that you don't have any easy answers anymore. There's no document to go to. There's no tenets to look at and study. You have to sit with yourself and with your understanding of ethics and morality and decide all of the big problems every time, because there's no pathway. There's no deck of cards that have been handed to you that you can just play as life goes along. You have to think about it. Thoreau, whether or not he was an atheist, I don't even remember. Doesn't matter. He believed that by both being human and by being citizens, but also by being not just human, but a person, you would naturally take to this idea of thought, introspection. Of course, he was living on a pond, more or less by himself, so it was easier for him. He said then, the only obligation which I have a right to assume is to do at any time what I think right. And again, he's talking about a war that was funding slavery. It is truly enough said that a corporation has no conscience, but a corporation of conscientious men is a corporation with a conscience. This has been one of my favorite quotes to go back to over the years because I find it so stunning. It shouldn't be. It shouldn't be that big a revelation, like, oh, so corporations, big, monolithic, financial and political structures, they can't have a conscience, right? They can't be anything except what they are. They are either there to provide a service, or to make money, or to govern a certain part of the world that we live in. Whatever they're there to do, that's their job, and that's what they're going to do. Conscience doesn't come into it. However, if the people who run the corporation are people with consciences, then there shouldn't ever be a time when a corporation crosses the line and does something like exploit its workers, or lie to them, or pull dirty tricks. These things shouldn't be able to happen, because the people who are running them should be able to say, that's not right. And there have been lots of movies that have come out like this. There was the one that Russell Crowe was in years ago with Matt Damon. Was it Russell Crowe? It was at least Matt Damon. Was it The Insider, about the guy with the smoking thing? That kind of whistleblowing mentality comes from Thoreau and the concept of civil disobedience. It is, however, interesting that nobody seems to hold our modern corporations writ large to this standard. We make lots of excuses for them and their behavior. Well, they're just trying to make money. I mean, you're an idiot if you don't think that that's what they're doing. Of course they're doing that. That's their job. Well, yes, but like Thoreau said, a corporation has no conscience, but a corporation of conscientious men is a corporation with a conscience. Law never made me a whit more just. So I'm not just. I'm not somebody who is going to be moral, ethical, behave legally just because there's a law telling me to do it. And by means of their respect for it, even the well-disposed are daily made the agents of injustice. If you follow the law blindly, it's like following anything blindly without question. It's like I had a kid my first year that I was teaching high school. I had a kid in my room. I had very short hair at the time, which is kind of funny knowing how long it is now. But I had a kid in my classroom who accused me in class in front of everybody of personally bringing about the end times because my hair was short. And I said, wow, I didn't know that was part of the lineup in the end times thing. Tell me more. And he said, well, because in the Bible, in the book of Revelations, it says when women look like men and men look like women, that's one of the signs of the end times. And I said, huh, because I've read my Bible. And I had a Bible in class because we were doing Shakespeare. And it's really important to have a Bible around when you're doing Shakespeare because there's lots of references to things both in the Old Testament and the New. So I grabbed the Bible, I handed it to him, and I said, find me the passage, because dude, if I'm bringing about the end times, I'm going to start wearing a wig or something. I don't want to be the one responsible for ending everything. Hadn't even had kids at that point. What would I think? So I handed him the Bible and he spent the rest of the class looking for it. And he came back and he said, I can't find it. And I said, well, it was news to me. Are you sure it's actually in the Bible? And he said, oh yeah, well, my pastor told me it was. I said, go back and get your pastor to show you the passage and then come show me, because seriously, I want to know if I'm doing something that is going to cross a line for a lot of students. That would be a bad thing for me to do. Why would I want to make it harder for them to pay attention and learn if they think that I'm trying to end the world? He never came back with any answer from his pastor. Again, buying something whole cloth without doing any research, any thought, any work of your own can be very dangerous. Following the law simply because it is the law might mean that you behave unjustly or are an agent of injustice. Now, some people have taken that to do things like not pay their taxes and then get ticked off when the feds show up to arrest them. That is not as far as Thoreau would say, that is not a rationally reasoned stance. If you break the law, you don't pay your taxes. As an act of civil disobedience, you do not pay your taxes. You have now broken a law. You now have a consequence for that behavior. Rights, responsibilities. If you don't live up to any of those responsibilities, then you have consequences. Thoreau was very clear about that. Some people seem to think that by refusing to pay taxes or refusing to participate in some part of our governmental system, that they're making a grand gesture and they're fighting the good fight, and that by doing that, they're going to get a pass. No, that's not how it works. Martin Luther King, letter from Birmingham jail. Thoreau wrote his letter from prison. Gandhi, God, how many times was that man imprisoned? And what is it, Satyagraha, the practice of passive resistance in India? Our translation for that is really wonky. Our translation as passive resistance makes it sound like it's very weak. And oh, don't hurt me. I'm just going to lay down here in the dust, and I'm gonna make you feel bad because I'm lying here in the dust, and that's why you're going to suddenly stop trying to stomp all over my country. No. Gandhi's stuff was so seriously political and hardcore, and their passive resistance, all it meant was that they weren't going to carry a weapon. It didn't mean their bodies didn't become acts of resistance on a regular basis, but also the targets that they chose to resist against were very cleverly chosen, and there was nothing passive about those decisions and those choices. So Thoreau, Martin Luther King, and Gandhi often get lumped together because of the political side of their movement. And of course, one of the things that people don't talk about is the political side of what Jesus was doing. He lived in an occupied country, and the Jews weren't doing so great back then either. And so the Romans, who were the guys who did the crucifixion thing, as you know if you watch Gladiator, they're stomping all over Israel. The Jews and all of the other ethnic minorities are under the thumb of the Romans. There are plenty of people who were looking for someone to come and free them from bondage, literal bondage, from the Romans who were sitting on top of them. So again, some of the things that Jesus says, or some of the things that are attributed to him in the four Gospels, depending on which one you read, some of this stuff is really pretty hardcore. When he overturns the tables in the temple with the moneylenders, that is angry Jesus, politically angry Jesus, and religiously angry Jesus. And it's interesting watching where those things overlap in history, because of course before there was science, there was religion, and religion filled that position that science eventually moved into. And then you have two different spheres. And then as we get more complicated in our societies, you start to see the siloing of all of these things: religion, science, politics, all that stuff. Thoreau is back here saying philosophy and morality, thought, careful judgment, not a knee-jerk belief in anything, not the law, not anything. That's what can lead you to living a good moral life, where you are doing maybe not no damage, but you're doing as little damage as you can to any other living, breathing, thinking being on the planet, which sounds kind of nice. I don't know. Maybe. Then he goes on to say, where's the next part that I wanted to read you? He talked a lot about the military, because of course at the time this was the kind of the beginning of the standing army in the United States, and there was, you can imagine, there were a lot of people who were really freaked out about this. The idea that there would be a full-time army after having had a militia where my husband, your son, our neighbor next door, these were the guys who were going to protect us. We knew them. It's like when baseball teams switched from being hometown kids to a marketplace where people are getting traded and free agency and all this stuff. It's not a hometown kid anymore. It's not so much fun. It's kind of the same thing with the first standing army. All of a sudden, the guys who are protecting you, you don't know them. And that's unnerving. So then, after he talks about that, he says, the mass of men serve the state thus, not as men mainly, but as machines with their bodies. They are the standing army and the militia, jailers, constables, etc. In most cases, there is no free exercise whatever of judgment or of the moral sense, but they put themselves on a level with wood and earth and stones, and wooden men can perhaps be manufactured that will serve the purpose as well. Now, I understand today that you need to have soldiers who follow directions, who follow orders, or they're going to get themselves and everybody else killed. That wasn't as well understood at the time. This whole standing army idea was kind of new. So he felt very uneasy about any group of people, again, who just took what was being told to them as law with no thought. And then he goes on to say, such people, these guys, command no more respect than a man of straw or a lump of dirt. They have the same sort of worth only as heroes and dogs, yet such as these even are commonly esteemed good citizens. Others, as most legislatures, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders, serve the state chiefly with their heads. And, as they rarely make any moral distinctions, they are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as to serve God. Because again, and he goes back to it, it's this idea that they're going to do it without thinking. They're not going to use their heads. They're not going to consider what they're doing. It's just pushing the paper along, passing the buck. Somebody else can deal with the moral implications of these things. And then one of his quotes, I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization at the time as my government, which is a slave's government also. You can't be my government if you justify the keeping of slaves. That isn't my government. That's not what I believe in. And again, he was willing to resist, and in resisting, he went to jail for a little while. I was going to see if there's another part that I can get to quickly. No, then he gets into some specific stuff about Massachusetts proper. But the other thing is the very beginning. I wanted to get to the corporation thing first. But at the very beginning, he says, I heartily accept the motto that government is best, which governs least. This gets misunderstood. So, that government is best, which governs least. And I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which also I believe. That government is best, which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it. He did not believe in no government. He believed that we were going to mature as a people to a point where we didn't need government to do a lot of the things that government was doing at the time. That eventually we wouldn't need to have wars with other people because we would be thoughtful, rational, balanced, healthy people who were capable of discussing and considering and coming to decisions that were mutually beneficial for everyone. Sure, there were going to be compromises, but that was to be expected. That's the way a marriage works. That's the way life works. That's the way everything works. when he says the government is best which governs not at all, that doesn't mean no government. That means we are ready to have a government. You know, there's a group of people who make sure the trains run on time, and they take the taxes and say, okay, well, what do we all need? Okay, we need an interstate system, highways. Let's use the tax money to build that. Everybody benefits. That's great. Our tax dollars go in together. It forms a giant wad of cash, and now we have an interstate highway system. That wouldn't have been a problem if it had been something that people had agreed on the necessity for. Because that wouldn't be the government imposing anything on you. That would be ground up decision making. Hey, I'm a grocer. I can't get my goods to all the different marketplaces that want my stuff because I can't travel 16 hours by car every weekend when it should only take me an hour and 15 minutes if the roads were decent. You know, they hear enough about that. It's time to start fixing things up. It's very different what he's talking about than no government. Although there are plenty of people who pull these quotes out of context and make it fit a more individualized kind of a libertarian take on how government should be right now. Of course, our world is a little bit more complicated than it was in Thoreau's time, so that's another factor. And again, he ends with, it'd be great for it to govern not at all when men are prepared for it. That will be the kind of government which they will have. Government is, at best, but an expedient. But most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. Now, this is something I saw happen a long time ago. Do you remember Live Aid? Bob Geldof raised a lot of money for the really horrifying famine, drought and famine that was happening in Ethiopia. And raised a ton of money with Live Aid, and it was amazing, actually, to watch. And within a year, there was some scuttle about, oh, the money's being wasted, or oh, the money's this, that, or the other thing. Well, my dad worked with famine relief organizations, early famine warning systems, different ways to help the people, not the governments, the people. To him, and I said, okay, well, what is this true? Have you found anything about this? Is all that money being wasted? And he said, well, no, not the way that you're thinking of it. Not in a way that says, oh, these people are crooked and they're just throwing your money around, you know, taking out $100 bill to light a cigar with. It's not that. It's if you want to move quickly, you will move inefficiently. It's like turning the Titanic. Can't do it on a dime. If you want to proceed in a more financially, fiscally prudent way, then de facto, you have to move more slowly. And you're not going to be able to do both quickly. And was there money that was wasted? Probably. Did the people need the aid right away? Yeah. Same thing happened recently with Haiti. It's the same thing. You can't move quickly and save money, which I think we probably all experienced when there's been an emergency or something that we've had to deal with. It's just like Thoreau. So then he goes on to say about the standing army, that the people have chosen to have this happen, and it is part of our tradition, and one that he was kind of surprised by. So I'm going to put up another graphic for you, which I love. This is Thoreau again. Disobedience is the true foundation of liberty. The obedient must be slaves. In his 1845 speak, that means if you are obedient, that means de facto that you are a slave. You're not thinking. If you are merely obedient, you are not thinking. So that is one of his statements. And then there was another one. I thought this one was kind of fun. And this is Emerson, always do what you were afraid to do, which I like. There was another one that the theater side of me liked a lot, which is kind of goofy. This is Emerson as well. And that's kind of a nice thought, right? That everybody starts somewhere. I like that. That recognition that not all of us come out of the gate as perfect little pieces of perfection. I like that. That's deep. And then there's this. Thoreau talked a lot about the exchange of freedoms for security, much like Ben Franklin talked about those who sacrifice their liberty for a little bit of security deserve neither liberty or their freedom for security deserve neither liberty or freedom. That idea of there being a price. The price of anything is the amount of life you exchange for it. It's true, right? You know, are you paying more attention to your kids, or are you paying more attention to your job? Is there a way that you can not have that happen? Sometimes it doesn't feel that way. It's very, very hard these days to find a balance. And Thoreau, unfortunately, doesn't give us any real help with any of that. But he does say, rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. And again, for him, truth wasn't necessarily something that he was going to get out of a box of Cracker Jacks. It was something that he was going to have to work for and work hard for to figure out what the truth was. Was he living in a post-fact world? No. He believed in facts. For him, those facts rarely weighed on these kind of philosophical discussions, unless you're talking about something like the war. Fact, there's a war. Fact, the taxes raised also go to support slavery. Fact, the amount of money that he didn't pay was pennies. Fact, by not paying his taxes, he wound up knowing that he was going to have to, and then going to jail. So he wasn't anti-fact at all. He was just his own special self. There's one other. This is the graphic of the quote that started all of this today. And in light of Citizens United and some of the other First Amendment things that have been happening and are going to continue happening over the next several years, I thought this was a good thing to keep in mind. So it was a little detour, a little rest area stop on the way to the First Amendment, but it gives us some common ground when we talk about it. And if all goes well, I will have a special guest for you when we do the First Amendment. I'm very hopeful. I hope you have a great week. I hope you had a marvelous Christmas. If you celebrated Christmas, I hope you're having a great Hanukkah. If you're celebrating Hanukkah, Kwanzaa. I don't know what else you could have. I hope it's good though, and you're having a great time doing it. I'll talk to you in either 1 or 2 weeks. I'll have the new live stream up as a link at youtube.com/craftlit-channel-hyphen. And if you have a comment or a question, please, please, please call 206-350-1642, or you can write me at heather@craftlit.com, and we'll get to it. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your holiday season, and I'll talk to you soon.